Welcome to the Story a Day podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It is Julie from the Story a Day podcast here, and I'm back with the second part of my interview with Gabriela Pereira of DIYMFA. We talked a couple of weeks ago about general writing stuff, and I promised you there was another episode coming where we would talk about some other issues that often affects creative people, one of those being mental illness. So I hope that you will enjoy this episode. It's a frank discussion about a serious issue, but it's not somber. We're not going to depress you. Hopefully we'll inspire you and encourage you if you or anyone you know faces any of these issues. You talk about more than just writing these days. You go out and you talk about entrepreneurship, which is part of the DIYMFA thing, but you've also started to talk more about mental health. And I wondered if we could talk about that a little bit, because it is the whole, being a writer, the whole lifestyle. It's not something that you do in a pocket of your life. It is your whole life is, you are a writer and your whole life affects it. And I think there's obviously always been an overlap in creativity and people who think and feel deeply and mental health issues. And, everything from writing involves everything from the simple issues of mindset and getting yourself to the desk, and right through the spectrum to people who are dealing with more, I know serious isn't the right word, but actual mental health issues. So can I ask you a little bit about that? Yes. And why you decided, or just, why it's important?
All right.
And what advice you would have for people who are struggling in any way?
Let's get real. All right. I'm going to get really real here. DIYMFA was not my first choice. This was not my first career choice. I know it sounds like a shocker. And for people who see me now, if they hear me say that, they would be completely shocked. DIYMFA came out of me not being able to hold an actual real office job. And this happened because I have bipolar disorder. So I was undiagnosed for many, many years. Eventually I got diagnosed, and I was in the process of building my career and trying to figure out how I was going to manage this mental illness. And by the way, I don't call things mental issues or mental neurodiversity. It is a mental illness. It freaking sucks. I want to be real about the fact that mental illness is just sucks. So, I was working, my dream job was, I wasn't going to be the CEO of DIYMFA. I wanted to be the CEO of Mattel or Hasbro. I trained my entire career from when I was 3 years old until I was out of first grad school, and working in the toy industry. That was what I did. Every move I made as a teenager, every internship I got, was thinking ahead to how am I going to be at the top of the game as a toy designer. That was my vision. That is what I wanted to do since I was able to talk. And I got a job at a toy company, and I totally kicked butt because that's what I do. And then I had a meltdown. And so I was seeing a doctor, and he was like, you really need to be taking this medication. And I asked him, okay, what are the side effects? And he's like, well, you can't operate heavy machinery, at least not for a good long while. And I'm like, well, cars are heavy machinery, right? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, well, the only way to get to this job is to drive a car. So for about a year, I went unmedicated because I thought it was better to be unmedicated than to possibly be a wreck a potential wreck on the road. I thought it would be safer. And it turned out it was maybe safer for the other people on the road, but probably not safer for me as a human. And it took a wake-up call of being in the hospital to realize that I really had to make a hard choice. And so I looked at my life and was like, well, clearly I can't have this job, since I can't, I have to choose between being survival as a human or being safe and, not taking medication and being safe versus taking medication and actually surviving. And so I made the choice to take medication and survive. And I gave notice. I came back from the hospital, and the next day I gave notice at my job. Now, being the, Gabriela that I am, I had already closed out every single product for the following year. They were already on the ships, like in transit to the warehouse. So like everything, I went to my boss. I'm like, look, everything's fine. I'm giving you my 2 weeks notice. All the products that I've been, all 150 or so of them are ready to go. Thanks. And she she lost it. She was really not happy about this, but it had to happen. And for like months after that, my boss kept trying to get me back to rejoin. And I'm like, I can't, I literally cannot get to work. And because of the stigma around mental illness, I never told her why. I told her, yes, I like, it was a health problem. So she probably, like, the whole office probably thought I had some like horrific cancer or something. But I told them, like, I didn't want to tell them that it was mental health, that it was bipolar disorder. I just told them that, I have this health thing and I can't work anymore. So anyway, DIYMFA came from me. Like, once I realized I had to quit that entire career trajectory that had been building up for like multiple decades, I realized, like, okay, what job can I get where I don't need to commute by car or at all, and where my hours can be flexible. And if I have a mental breakdown, I can take the couple of weeks off and, be in the hospital or be just not well at home, and like not have my career implode entirely. And writing came up as something that was, that kind of fit all those, checked all those boxes. And I'd always been good at writing. It was one of those things that like I'd done well in school, and I was always like the writer and, doodling and writing stuff and telling stories. So it kind of felt like a good fit. So I was like, all right, let me try this writing thing. And that's when I went and got my MFA, because I didn't know how to go about becoming a writer. I'd spent my whole life becoming a toy designer. I didn't know what it meant to become a writer. So I, looked it up and was like, oh, there's a school for that. Okay, let me go to that school. And so I did. And then, of course, lo and behold, DIYMFA happened. And of course, now I look back on all of this and I'm like, thank goodness I had bipolar and I had to quit that job and I could start DIYMFA, because this is so where I need to be right now. But it was really hard to make that choice and to have to give up this thing that I really wanted for decades of my life. So, around them, I forget what your question was exactly, but the issue of like mental illness is something that is near and dear to my heart, because it has impacted my entire life in really big ways.
Well, I think when you get, excuse me, when you get involved, when you get into a room with other writers, or when you're having ongoing conversations with writers over time, and you get to know each other and you start to open up to each other, this comes up all the time.
Yeah.
And we talk about it amongst ourselves, kind of quietly and off inside conversations. And it's only really just starting to become more of an open topic. And I'm hearing more successful writers talk about this now and be open about it on Twitter and be open about it on, social media. And, yourself, you talk about it very openly. So I'm glad that that's happening, because it's so much more healthy and so much more helpful for people to know that they're not, I shouldn't use the crazy word, but like you think you're crazy, people think they're crazy, but they're not crazy. They have mental health issues. It's a very different.
Oh no,
thing to
I'm
say.
fully aware that when I am like going down one of those roads, I am legit crazy. But that's okay. Like, I embrace it. I'm cool.
But I think if you know that there's a cause and it's not like a choice you're making, that I think that's helpful. And so the more we talk about this, I think, and because people who are sensitive and deep thinkers, there tends to be that correlation. So I'm glad to hear these conversations happening. And one of the things that I find really helpful is when someone who has mental health issues and is very productive and putting themselves out there has advice for other people who are maybe having a bad day.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for somebody who, maybe some of the time it's going well, and then you have those black days? How do you, because I see people who have that and they have careers and it doesn't seem possible except when they talk about it. So,
right. Before I answer that, I want to reframe how we talk about mental illness, because as writers, I think, we all believe that words are really powerful. And so I believe that if we change our words, we change our own thinking and change the thinking of the people around us. So a couple of things that I want to challenge people listening to this podcast to start shifting in the way they talk. One of them is not confounding the person with the illness. We hear this a lot where people will say, oh, so-and-so's bipolar. I am not bipolar. I have bipolar. I make a very big point of correcting people when they say, oh, you're bipolar. And I say, no, no, no. I'm Gabriela. Nice to meet you. I have bipolar. That is really important distinction because people are not their mental illness. And again, I use the word mental illness deliberately because it sucks. I also, another thing that I don't like that I think we need to consider reframing is calling mental illness some sort of silver lining or some sort of superpower. Bipolar is not a superpower. Yes, I may seem to have superhuman abilities when I'm going hypomanic. That is totally true, but it is not a freaking superpower because that kryptonite is really freaking painful. So when we start to treat mental illness like it's somehow, I think there's this need that people have to make it seem like it's a special good thing, but it's not a good thing. And if we keep treating it like it's a special skill or a special attribute, then we're kind of dismissing it. We're not actually acknowledging that there is work that needs to be done, both on the chemical side, like people need to be finding better medications and doing better research so that we can continue to improve quality of life for folks who have these mental illnesses, but work that needs to be done as a society to deal with this. Like we need to have workplaces that will be open to someone walking up to their boss and saying, hey, look, I need a 2-week leave because I have bipolar disorder and I am in the pit of despair right now. We do not have a culture where that is okay. Like that is we are living in a culture where people are afraid to have those conversations. So when we dismiss mental illness as a superpower or a special skill or something like that, it kind of makes it easier for folks who don't have it to ignore the really profound impact that these illnesses have on the people who do have it. So this is why, for instance, I don't like the term neurodiversity. It makes it sound like it's special. It's not. It's just what it is. And then the third thing that I think we need to stop, and it sort of ties to like the treating mental illness as a special thing, is, I know I'm a special snowflake, but it's not because of the bipolar. But it's the causality issue. So I hear a lot of people, like they'll come up to me and they're like, wow, you've achieved so much despite the bipolar. And I'm like, no, I achieved so much because I work really, really hard. I also happen to have bipolar. These two things can coexist in one human body, but they're not like, it's not like I had to work against it in some way, or that there's some sort of, like the minute you use words like because of or in spite of, you are assigning a causality between the success or the failure and the mental illness. And that, I think, gives the mental illness way too much power over the outcome. So I think it's far more important to change the language and say, wow, you've achieved so much. And alongside that, you also have bipolar. Wow. That is a much more, in my opinion, realistic and truthful way to handle it. And also one that doesn't put the mental illness in a position where it can cause or derail whatever outcome it is. So I think if we start to shift just those three little things, like not calling it a superpower, not confounding the person with the illness. It's interesting. Not all we do this with a lot of other physical ailments. Like we say someone's diabetic. We very rarely say someone has diabetes. We say someone is HIV positive, not someone has HIV. But then we never say someone is heart disease or someone is cancerous. Like, and
that would be really terrible.
I know, right? And I've thought long and hard about this. And I think my theory is that the reason we have this, we confound the person and the illness with illnesses that have a stigma attached to them. When there isn't that stigma, Like there isn't a stigma with cancer. So nobody would ever dream of saying someone is, tumorously endowed or something like that. Like that would never happen. But like we do have a stigma against, even for better or for worse, against HIV, and diabetes carries a stigma, and mental health carries a stigma. So people say, so-and-so is schizophrenic as opposed to has schizophrenia. So I think,
and much the same with people who use wheelchairs. Like I know someone who I think refers to themselves as a person who uses a wheelchair. Not any other term. I'm a wheelchair user. Like, okay, great.
Wheelchair user, yeah.
And it's really important that people talk up and ask for what, like to ask for the terms that make sense and that destigmatize and that empower and make things better, so that we don't everyone else doesn't accidentally perpetuate a bad situation.
And I get that, like, this is an ongoing process. Like, for instance, the term neurodiversity is kind of new, and I get that people are trying it on as a way to talk about mental health stuff in a way not stigmatizing. Mm-hmm. What it does, though, is it's sort of like the pendulum swings in such the opposite direction that now it's like we're kind of dismissing the fact that it is a serious issue. So I think, we just need to find better language. And as writers, we are the community who can start to champion that language. Like, let's us start by trying out different words for different aspects around mental illness and be deliberate and thoughtful about how we use our words, and then teach other people to use them too. So that didn't quite answer your first question, but I wanted to add that in because I think it's really important for us as a community of writers to have that in our minds in terms Absolutely. Of like, what, if someone's having a bad day or if someone's struggling, there are a couple of things. First, the struggle is real. Don't dismiss it. People will often say, oh, you can just pick yourself up, go out for a walk. If I had a nickel for every time someone says to me, like, just get outside in the sunshine, I'm like, screw the sunshine. I hate the sun. I hate this whole universe. Like, when I am in the pit of blackness, I do not need that. So acknowledge if you were having a bad day, allow yourself to have that bad day. Now, it doesn't mean that you wallow in the bad day and that you ruminate and that you make it worse, but give yourself the grace, like extend the grace to yourself, to like give yourself space to just have the day suck and recognize that, like, this is a bad day and I can get through it. And I've had bad days before and I can get back to where I was. The I've had bad days before thing, like, that has really been important for me. Like, acknowledging that I've managed to get through really bad situations in the past, because when you're in it, when you're in the pit of blackness, the pit of just horrific darkness, it feels like it will last forever, but it doesn't. And I know because I've been there many, many, many times in my past, and every single time, eventually, sometimes it takes a couple of days, sometimes it takes several weeks or a month or however long, but eventually I get out on the other side. But it's really hard to remember that you were able to get out on the other side. So what I would encourage you to do is to, when you do find yourself coming out of the darkness, record that. Somehow make note of that, celebrate that, and put that somewhere where when you are in the pit of darkness, you can go back and look and say, oh, wait, this is waiting for me on the other side. Like, this is what it feels like to be back to myself. Because it is really hard when you're in that place. It's like you're in this vortex of doom and there's no time and there's nothing. And it feels like you will never get out of it, but you do. We all do eventually. We just have to remind ourselves and have something to hold on to so that we know that it can be better. The other thing is just recognizing that, like, there's a lot of people out there struggling with this who don't show it. I'm very good at hiding it. Unless I purposefully come out and talk about what's gone on in my life, most people wouldn't know that I have bipolar. Most people wouldn't know that I've been hospitalized multiple times. Like, people wouldn't know that. But you never, and it's funny, I have mixed feelings every time there's some big, celebrity harms themselves and like thing that happens, and all the people come out of the woodwork talking about mental health, and like the thing that always comes up is like, we never would have known, we never knew this person was struggling, or you never know what's going on behind the mask. The truth is we all have masks. We are all struggling with something. There's not a single person out there in the world who doesn't have some struggle. Even infants have struggle. It's called, I'm hungry, feed me. Like all humans struggle with something. And so we have to recognize that like we're not alone in that. And while our struggles may be going into a very different dark place than what someone else's struggles might be going into, it's still a struggle. And so you're not alone. And recognizing that, I think, is super important. That's what I hold on to.
That's so helpful, and just a really great, I think, encapsulation of what it might be like. I think one of the things that I hear from people is that when you're in that down cycle, you're still aware that you've got all of this other stuff in your life that needs to be done. And I imagine that that adds a layer of sort of panic and I imagine it just makes everything more difficult.
Yes.
And I wondered if you have any advice for people, because I think when you said allowing yourself to have a bad day is excellent advice. Or bad, like how do you advise arranging your life? What things can you put in place so that there's space in your life for that?
Safety
as a creative person.
Safety nets are really important. So I never work right up against a deadline, ever. If I have a deadline, I have to get the thing in at least 2 days before, if not like a week before. And I need to know that I am that far ahead of the deadline, so that if I do, and the reason I do this is because I know that I could potentially implode, and that if I have that space, this allows me the space to say, wow, I'm having a really rough day right now. I need to call up my psychiatrist and we need to adjust something. And that gives me like the 48-hour window of like being completely unproductive, so that if I need to then, like run up against the deadline, I can. But I've learned the hard way that having a deadline for someone with my situation is like, I will actually not put deadlines, the real deadlines, in my calendar. I do not actually save any documentation that has the real deadline on it. I put a earlier deadline on my calendar and then hide all the emails that said, this is your deadline. It's kind of crazy, but it's what keeps me to that schedule, so that I know I have that buffer and I know that I'm going to have that wiggle room. Having a team has been instrumental, like having other people around me. And by team, I don't just mean like a work team, but having like a husband who is a team player and who is really, really good at being the consistent parent in the household and being there for our kids for like all the runny noses and scraped knees, so that if mom has a really bad weekend, she can just, crash out, and that's okay. Is it perfect? Of course not. My kids notice that there are times when grumpy mommy's up and about, but like, it's what we do to make it work. And I wouldn't be like, if I were a single parent, my kids would probably not survive. Like, it would be a very serious problem here. And so I'm incredibly lucky to have a really supportive spouse. Other things that we've set up in our team, and I recognize this comes from a place of privilege, but it's also for us a necessity. We have a full-time nanny who is with our kids full-time. She doesn't, now that they're in school full-time, she does not come in early in the mornings, but she is there well into the evening. And she with me tag teams to manage the kids and their schedules and yada yada. This would not, like, I would not be able to do that on my own. I need to have that safety net. And it allows me to, like, a few weeks back, I just had a really rough couple of days, and I like needed to hide in my bed for a couple of days. And I knew I could do that, and my kids would still get picked up from school. They'd still get fed. They'd still get bathed. They'd still practice their instruments. Like, all these things would still happen because we had someone on our team. This is something that I see as an investment as like a business owner, but also as a human. Like, we have chosen to invest in having this person, this amazing woman on our team to help with this stuff because I would not be able to do it on my own.
Yeah, and I think you can probably assemble a team for some of your needs from your friends, you know.
Absolutely. Or
People to
family
check in.
members. Like
Yeah.
you could also have, I know my parents, for instance, they live not too far away. So when I'm having a rough patch, they are often a lot more present in our household than they are most other times of the year. They know, like they can tell from the sound of my voice when they call exactly where I am in my ups and downs. And they suddenly start showing up with like casseroles and like showing up with like, oh, let's watch the kids today. So these, like, it doesn't necessarily mean also like you have to pay people and to have on your team. Like you probably have either friend network or family network or through your church or people you can rely on. But if you don't tell people that you're struggling, then they don't know and they can't help you.
And I've heard from other writers, you know, who have contracts and stuff like that, that this stuff can impact business. You know, sometimes it's unavoidable. You're going to miss a deadline. And they've said that the most important thing to do is to communicate. And I would imagine that after you've been through this a couple of times, you can see it coming. And I would also imagine it's hard to communicate, especially when you're in the depths. But like even at the beginning, it would be hard to communicate. But from what I've heard from other people, that it's really the most important thing is to reach out before you can't.
Yeah. So definitely reaching out before I can't. One of the things I did right out of the gate is I told my agent, and I was like, you just need to know this, because if something goes wrong, I may not be in a place where I can tell my editor, but you can tell my editor. And that way, like we have that covered. As far as the like foreseeing when it's coming, that part is a little tricky because like for me, it actually took a lot of training and a lot of mindfulness training to train my brain to recognize what my moods were. Because one of the things that I think, at least for me, happened is because it took me about 20 years, 24, 5 years to get really diagnosed, like actually a real diagnosis. And in that time, like I built up mechanisms, defense mechanisms to keep myself from derailing. So like I'd started showing signs of bipolar when I was like a preteen, but I didn't get diagnosed until I was 25. So that's a long span of time to build up a lot of baggage. And one of the defense mechanisms that I realize now that I'd set into place was clamping down on everything. Not just emotion, but everything sensory, to the point where when I was pregnant and having labor pains with my son, I didn't actually feel contractions until they were so bad they were unbearable. So like, you know how they say, like, is the pain a 1 or a 10? Until it got to like a 9, I didn't feel anything. And it was because I'd literally trained my body to shut down, like over the years and years and years of shutting down all emotion and sensation. I trained my body not to feel stuff. And that was my way of surviving because I didn't know how else to survive. Now, obviously, with medication and therapy and all that good stuff, I have other mechanisms, and I started learning what it feels like to be sad. Like I remember the first time I realized what it actually felt like to be legit sad and not depressed. It was really shocking. I was like, well, that's what sad feels like. Just a few weeks ago, I realized what happy felt like for the first time. Like, to think about that for a minute, I'd gone my entire life until my 40s, and I had never really knew what happy felt like because I'd clamped that down for so long. Really crazy. But so like sometimes it's not easy to see when it's coming because your brain creates these mechanisms to shut stuff down. So what I recommend for folks, if they are in that boat where it feels like their moods or their crashes are coming out of nowhere, which is very real for a lot of people, is have someone else who's outside of you, who's good at gauging when you're spiraling. For me, that's my husband. He can tell when I'm going to spiral before I can. Now I'm getting better at it. But the other thing is to start like doing some sort of mindfulness or meditation. That's what's helped me with learning to identify what things feel like so that I can start to identify the shades of gray. Because before I had only really understood the like 0 or 10, like the two extremes, but there's like a whole lot of numbers in between. So just like taking a moment to be aware, like, all right, how sad am I? how frustrated am I in this moment? Is this like a 10 in frustration or a 2? And start to get a sense for what, like calibrate internally what that means for you. That will then help you to start to anticipate things when they, start to go south. And then of course you can reach out for support before, you do a nosedive.
Yeah, and just sort of disappear from the world for a few days, and people don't know where you are. This is so great and so important and helpful. So thank you so much for talking about this. And I'm going to stop asking you questions because I could keep you on here for hours, because I think it really is so important to talk about the whole life aspect of being a writer, being a creative person, existing. And we write for so many reasons, but one of them is to understand ourselves and understand the world. And this is just all a huge part of that package. And anything, I think, talking about this is going to help other people to understand that they're not alone, and give them some ideas. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to leave people with one last thought.
Yeah.
The other place to turn, if you aren't quite sure about your own internal calibrations, is look at your writing. One of the things I notice now looking back is that a lot of my early characters were kind of prickly and didn't really show emotion very much. And that is very telling given where I am now and what I've observed in myself for like the last however many years of writing. It kind of makes sense that my early characters behaved in that way. So sometimes your writing is telling you something about yourself that you may not necessarily realize. So if you're not able to sort of read yourself very well, see what your characters are telling you, because chances are they're reflecting back to you something about you.
And you will probably hear that from critique partners. They'll say things like, your characters aren't, I don't know what she's feeling, and things like that. So
Exactly.
That's an interesting question. If we can go a little more back into the writing stuff, if you do struggle with getting emotion on the page, what can writers do to overcome that?
Oh, I don't know. I suck at writing emotion. I'm really bad at that. Like,
all right,
that is the one thing that I'm just so bad at. My characters have a very hard time with feelings because I have a hard time with feelings.
Well, fine. We don't need to talk about that then.
I mean, I don't know. Do you have any ideas? Because like I could learn right now. I'm excited about this.
It's tough because I am an incredibly emotional person. I will sob at adverts, always have done. So for me, I think any advice I gave would sound trite, because it would be like, hello, just try and go inside, feel it. And, and if that doesn't work for you, then not. But I think maybe looking at psychology and models of human behavior is the way to go, because I think sometimes when people are very analytical, something like that, like looking at a model of how I've interviewed a sex therapist who talked about how to repair a relationship, a repair conversation, and she gave us the steps of how to go through that conversation. So looking at models like that, I think, would be helpful for people who are more analytical or engineering brained to say, okay, so this is what should be happening in this kind of conversation. Maybe I can use these and make people fail to do this step, and then that would create conflict, or so I think you can take an analytical look at it, but as always, the first step is awareness, knowing that you're missing that aspect of the writing, and then figuring out what you need to do. And I think when you are analytical, the good part of that is that you're willing to go out and figure stuff out. So that would be my off-the-cuff advice.
I just had an idea as you were talking. So in DIYMFA, one of the things we talk about is the Thetada method: thoughts, actions, dialogue, appearance. And the more I've taught this, so in the book, it's all about, like, you create a compass, and it's a diagnostic tool that you can use. It's not meant to be prescriptive, but it's diagnostic, where you can look at various scenes you've written, do the compass for each of those scenes for a given character, and kind of see if you're leaning too much on one or more of those elements and not enough on the others. This isn't about getting a perfectly balanced diamond inside the circle. It's about getting a sense for what your habits are and what your tendencies are. But one of the things I've noticed as I've taught the character compass more and more is that really when things get interesting in a scene, it's not just one of those components operating on its own. It's when one or more of those elements are at odds with each other. So if I were trying to figure out how to add more or how to like figure out the thoughts for my characters, because I know that thoughts are going to be pretty low in my, that's just a tendency that I have. What I would look at is, are there other things that are contradicting each other? Like, is the character doing something in their actions that is contradicting what they're saying, or is contradicting their appearance, how they look and how their affect? And then if you start to see those contradictions, that's where you can start to get a sense of like what's going on internally for that character. Because if the character's saying, oh, I'm fine, but really they look like they're about to kill you, you can probably get a sense that like that character's maybe a little bit peeved. So
Yes.
that's how I would, like, being an analytical person, that's one of the ways I would try to analyze it, to get at the heart of the emotion and then try to tease it out more.
So thank you so much for being here. This has been an amazing conversation. It's always great to talk to you. And I just, thank you for all that you do for us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's so great to be here. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week. And of course, keep writing.